question about recordings. So on the Jacksonville Jewish Center's YouTube channel, there are each of the Monday evening sessions has been recorded, and each one should be up within a day or so, two at most. I know last week's was put up, so we're good to go. Next week, I'll be participating in a program with the Federation on religion and race, along with panelists from UNF. So we're going to take a break for just 1 week. You are very much invited. You can go to the Federation website. I think it was sent through our email, but it's certainly on the Federation website. That's next Monday evening. And then on November 30th, we'll be back right here. We keep working our way through US presidents and the American Jewish community. So we'll get started. I'll pause at various points in between different presidents, so you can ask whatever questions about that particular administration. So hopefully tonight we're going to make it all the way through Abraham Lincoln and spend most of the time on Lincoln. But we had, excuse me, gotten up as far as John Tyler. Tyler being the vice president for William Henry Harrison, who died only 31 days into his administration. Just a brief word, though. We're in the 1840s, so what is the state of American Jewry? Well, in just a few years, American Jewry will start to grow exponentially. This will be the second wave. Largely Jews who come from Central Europe. There's a lot of upheaval in Europe around the middle of the 19th century. There are revolutions in France, in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and many of these Jews, when the revolutions fail, flee to the United States. Some are looking for personal betterment. Others are looking for more liberal and tolerant climates. So we'll go from maybe 15 or 20,000 Jews who are here in the 1840s, and suddenly that number will shoot up to somewhere between 150 and 175,000 by the end of the Civil War. That's a big jump. Not nearly as big as what will happen when Eastern European Jews come at the very end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, but compared to the previous movement of Jews, immigration of Jews, that German Jewish wave in the middle of the 19th century is big. So on the cusp of that, Jewish life is not, it's there. You've seen the beginnings of reform in various synagogues. Reform might mean introducing organs, mixed seating, sermons in the vernacular. They tended to be more in terms of the aesthetic of worship than they were necessarily far-reaching ideological reforms. The reform movement as an organized entity has not yet started. In Europe, it's well organized by the 1840s, but not in this country. So One of the early rabbis to come to the United States, a fellow named Abraham Joseph Rice. He serves the Baltimore Hebrew congregation. He comes and he leaves the rabbinate after just a couple short years. And I just thought I'd share this because I mean it was interesting to read. He leaves the rabbinate in disgust at the state of American Jewry. And what does he do? He opens up a dry goods store instead. I guess if you don't like the rabbinate, open up a dry goods store. So writing to a friend back in Germany, he described Jewish life as, quote, the religious life in this land is on the lowest level. Most people eat foul food and desecrate the Sabbath. And most people eat foul food, desecrate the Sabbath in public. Thousands marry non-Jewish women. Under these circumstances, my mind is perplexed, and I wonder whether it is even permissible for a Jew to live in this land. Probably good that he left the at that particular junction, if that's how he felt. But this was not, so atypical. So let's jump right back in. President Polk, James K. Polk, who only serves one term. He actually dies just very shortly after he gets out of office. He's not a well man. He's a Democrat, right? Originally from North Carolina. His family moved to Tennessee. Interesting, his father, who was a slave owner, specified that all of his slaves be freed. Right, so rather Polk, not his father. Polk and his wife Sarah have no children, and his will specifies that his slaves may be manumitted. That was one of the few times where actually it was easier to free slaves, because otherwise it got increasingly harder. Even if you wanted to manumit your own quote unquote property, you couldn't do that in many southern states. They didn't want to have freed blacks, but Polk does that. He has contact with several Jews through the Democratic Party. What's interesting is one of his biggest contacts. Let me put him up on the. Let's see, I'm going to share the screen. Let's see. Yeah, that's him. All right. Anybody recognize this guy? He's not Curly from the Three Stooges. It's David Levy Yulee, senator, first senator from Florida, and well, a Jew once upon a time. It's interesting about Levy. Let me see if I can. Here we go. Hopefully, everybody can see this. This over here, a little bit bigger. That house, I believe, is still standing. That was Yulee's house when he lived in Fernandina. And I think that house is still standing. One of the Victorian beauties that you can still see if you walk around Fernandina Beach.
There is no house.
There is no house on the screen?
No.
Oh, it says I'm screen sharing. Let's see. Why is there no house?
You still see David Levy.
Oh, hold on. That's very interesting. Do this. Do this. Let me stop the share. Let me try and do this again. Let's try this again. How about now? Is there a house?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes, it looks like the house that oh, I forget his name, lived in Hartford, Connecticut.
Okay.
Oh, Mark
Mark
Twain.
Twain. Yeah, but no, this is I can tell you for sure this is not. It's in Fernandina Beach.
I believe you, but it just
And you
looks.
can go see it. It's was David. I think there was even a plaque somewhere. It
It's
does
still,
not
it,
look
it's
quite like
still
this now.
it's still standing. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, if you can go to Further Beach and look at it, it's still standing. It's still there. Anyway, so what about David Levy Yulee? Now, a little bit about this guy who was an interesting fellow. David Levy's grandfather was Muslim. If you've ever wondered, Yulee, that sounds like such a weird name. It was his grandfather was Yaqub ibn Yulee. He was prominent member of the Sultan of Morocco's court. Now, during the earlier part of the early years of the 19th, actually, I guess no, it's probably still 18th century. Rachel Levy, who's the daughter of a Jewish physician, English physician, is captured by pirates. Can't make up stories like this. And she is sold to Yulee, Youli. I don't know how to spell in Arabic because I don't speak Arabic. When Yaqub ibn Yulee dies in 1792, Rachel, who's pregnant with Ibn Yulee's child, escapes back to England. She gives birth to a son, Moses Elias Levy. Okay. So, I mean, halachically, he's Jewish. His mom is. Father is Muslim. Never knows his father. Moses Elias Levy grows up. He marries a Sephardic woman from the Spanish Portuguese community. And in 1810, they have a child named David. All right, so that's David Levy Yulee. Now, the family moves from England to Florida. They become quite wealthy in property. Going back to the days, Florida is purchased by the United States from Spain in 1819. And so then it's a territory until 1845. So the family moves to Florida. They become wealthy. David's interested in politics. He serves as Florida's delegate to Congress. He pushes for the admission of the territory as a state. And wouldn't you know, when Florida becomes a state in 1845, he's elected as senator. However, a year later, so he is the first Jewish senator ever elected. He's still Jewish at this point. A year later, he meets a nice Christian girl who is the daughter of the ex-governor of Kentucky, and it would not do, sir, to have a fellow named Levy, as a son-in-law, as a nice prominent Southern family. I mean, Levy. It's true they make good rye bread and Levy's rye. You don't have to be Jewish to love Levy's, but apparently you did have to be Christian and change your name if you were David Levy. So what does he do? He creates an anglicized form of his Muslim grandfather's name. These days you just can be Smith or Jones, but so he becomes Yulee, Yulee. He marries the daughter of this ex-governor. He becomes Christian. He agrees to raise their children as Christians. But even with all of this, if you think that he escaped anti-Semitism, you would be wrong. Moses Levy was rather distraught and displeased with his son's decisions. He also was quite opposed to David Levy. Was a racist in the mold of many Southern politicians and gentlemen, using the term loosely, but he was quite the racist. He supported secession. Interestingly, the two Levies clash. That would be Uriah P. Levy, who we've heard of from before, right? Who at this point already is a captain, and they clash in the U.S. Senate in 1846. Why? Because Uriah wants to abolish flogging, and David Levy Yulee, who is the chair of the Naval Affairs Committee in the Senate, does not. He likes flogging. Probably practiced it with his slaves. In any event, after 1861, of course, when Florida leaves, Yulee resigns his seat. So he is a political confrere. He knows James Polk. Polk really doesn't have too many other Jewish contacts. His big claim to fame, of course, is that he is the one who pushes us into the Mexican-American War, which we win handily, and which results not only in Texas having become a state, but also vast territory in the Southwest and the West. So that's James Polk's claim to fame. He's succeeded in the following election. It's Zachary Taylor, and we've seen this again and again. You get a war, which then the war leads to a war hero. The war hero gets elected. We saw this with Tyler and Tippecanoe too, old Tip, right? We saw this with Andrew Jackson, old Hickory. So we'll see it with Zachary Taylor. He's in office just a little over a year. He's elected in 1848, inaugurated in March of 1849. He was called Rough and Ready. That was his nickname, not to be confused with the Rough Riders of TR, of Teddy Roosevelt. So his big thing was he won the Battle of Buena Vista, the Mexican-American War, where he defeated the enemy through his valor and where he was outnumbered by the Mexican forces 4-1. He dies after 16 months in office, so he's our second president who dies in office of natural causes. It's reported that he sat in the broiling July sun in Washington. At a ceremony, this was on July 4th. The Washington Monument was being built, right? And it was one of these marvels of the world. It took a long time to complete. But so he was sitting there for speeches and music for 2 hours. And then he came back to the White House, ate a large bowl of cherries washed down by a pitcher of cold milk. So was there something wrong with the cherries? I don't know. Is there something wrong with the milk? Who knows? Did he just have sunstroke? Who knows? But either way, 5 days later, he was dead. And he is succeeded by Millard Fillmore, who served from 1850 to 1853. He's the second president from New York State. He comes from rural upstate New York, I think near the Finger Lakes region. He himself, the Whigs kind of were Whiggish, wiggly on slavery, depending on, the Whigs could go either way. He was personally opposed to slavery, but he was more than ready and willing to compromise. And we'll see that there are two very significant accomplishments in his term as president. One, more far-reaching than the other, by far. Well, the first is that he installs indoor plumbing in the White House. Right. So that's pretty cool, I guess. But the second is the Compromise of 1850, and that's huge. It buys a little time, puts off the Civil War for another decade, a little more than a decade, 11 years. So the Compromise of 1850 what it does is admits California as a free state. Utah and New Mexico become territories, organized as territories, without any reference to slavery or not. The slave trade is abolished in Washington, D.C. Before then, you could buy and sell slaves in the nation's capital until 1850. Probably the most important aspect of the compromise was the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, which he starts negotiating all this while he's still as vice president, right? He's president of the Senate. And then after Taylor dies, he continues to shepherd and push it. He gets it passed because other moderates like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster support the compromise. Of course, the extremists, whether abolitionists or slavery everywhere all the time, they don't like any of it. They like certain things, but the more extreme you are, the more the word compromise is a dirty word. As far as Jews go, one interesting, a small note for Fillmore's administration, they signed a commercial treaty with Switzerland that allows the Swiss to grant full commercial rights to Christians, but gives them the right to deny entry to Jews holding American citizenship. Right now, the State Department doesn't insert this in the treaty, right? It's that would seem rather odd. It's the Swiss. Like the Swiss are actually historically far more bigoted. They have a reputation for being very well, I'm not sure about that, but they certainly, when it came to Jews, had some rather negative things historically, some baggage. Jewish leaders write to the president and the Secretary of State. Webster is at this point not in the Senate. He's Fillmore's Secretary of State. They urge the U.S. not to ratify the treaty, and Fillmore is 100% behind this. So with support, also from Webster and Clay, the treaty is not ratified, and will not. It will be put off for another 16 plus years, not till 1866, that the Swiss are willing to drop the discretion.
Rabbi.
Hold on, drop their discretion of denying American Jews access to Switzerland. Yes, Larry.
So American Jews could not even visit Switzerland. Is that the point?
No, they were not. They could visit as a private citizen. They were not given commercial rights.
No business.
No business. They knew you were Jewish, and again, it was at their discretion. They could kick you out. But I gave, Fillmore says you're right. We shouldn't be negotiating a treaty like that. That creates different classes of citizens, and that's what they do. They sideline the treaty. Now, Fillmore is also, he has a distinction of being the first president to offer a seat on the Supreme Court to a Jew, Judah P. Benjamin. Now, Benjamin was a senator from Louisiana. Fillmore makes the offer in 1852. Benjamin was a great orator. I mean, he was, one of the Senate's great orators of his time. He turns it down. And, he too, like Yulee, resigns his Senate seat in 1861, becomes a member of Jefferson Davis's cabinet, served in a lot of positions, Attorney General, Secretary of War, and finally, he's Secretary of State. And here is a good cocktail party piece of trivia. there's only one American Jew to appear on a piece of currency. Judah P. Benjamin. He's on the Confederate $2 bill.
Also, the first Jewish cabinet member in this country.
If you want to consider Jeff Davis's cabinet, part of this country, but yes, that is true. He could have been the first Jewish Supreme Court justice long before Brandeis, but he turned it down. I guess he liked his seat in the Senate.
You going to talk about his Jewish chops?
No, I mean, this is really on presidents. I mean, Benjamin didn't have very many Jewish chops. He was Jewish. He never denied it. Unlike Yulee, he didn't convert, but he married a Catholic woman in New Orleans, raised his children as all these folks, their kids disappeared. There's no, Jewish family left for any of these people. So after Millard Fillmore, who really wanted to, get a second term, wasn't even nominated. Franklin Pierce becomes the next president. Now he's a Northerner, he's a Democrat from New Hampshire. In fact, he was real good friends with Nathaniel Hawthorne. They both went to Bowdoin College in Maine. One of his biggest, in retrospect, we can say mistakes, is that he is a big supporter of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which prior to that, I mean, you had the Compromise of 1850, but you also had, whether you liked it or not, there was at least a consistent way of deciding whether or not a state would be slave or free if it was below the Missouri Compromise line. Missouri was the Compromise of 1820. Missouri was actually, funny enough, above the line, but pretty much there was a line drawn across the United States. So Florida was going to be a slave line. Missouri got in, even though it was above the line, as a slave state, but it was balanced by Maine, which broke away from Massachusetts. So it wasn't a long-term or a great solution, but at least it provided some consistency. The Kansas-Nebraska Act said, hey, popular sovereignty. New territories should get to decide on their own whether they're slave or state. They can have a referendum and let the majority of the residents make the decision. It really sounds good, except in a climate that is so inflamed politically. What you have is people of one persuasion or another traveling to these territories. In this case, really Kansas was the ground zero for a campaign of mayhem and murder and terrorism. There were massacres by both abolitionists and pro-slavery folk. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act is passed, and that just brings the Civil War closer. Interesting thing about Franklin Pierce, he was fond of the bottle. And he was totally out of his political depth. He was just, one of his contemporaries put it, described Pierce as a pleasant mediocrity at a time that demanded political giants in the White House. A pleasant mediocrity. That's a nice epitaph. However, he does have the distinction of being the only president whose name appears on a synagogue charter. Until 1856, the charter of Washington, D.C. prohibited the establishment of any non-Christian house of worship in the city, right? So despite the First Amendment, despite prohibitions of religious texts, there really was, in many ways, gaps between the ideal and the reality. And in this case, right, we talked about some state constitutions that had some pretty wonky things, especially earlier in American history. But in DC, it's federal territory. And that's how Franklin's signature gets on the synagogue charter. Because in 1856, Congress enacts legislation proposing, quote, all the rights, privileges, and immunities heretofore granted by law to the Christian churches in the city of Washington be, and the same hereby are, extended to the Hebrew congregation of said city. Pierce signs the bill, and that's what makes it possible for our capital's first synagogue to come into being. And the Washington Hebrew congregation is established. It's still there. It's a Reformed synagogue, but very much there. And
Washington.
the document somewhere has Franklin Pierce's signature on it.
No, Jesus, even over.
A couple things more about Pierce, and then I'll stop if there are any questions. Pierce does have a number of relationships with Jews in his administration. August Belmont is one. If you ever read Stephen Birmingham's book, Our Crowd, he's one of the big German Jewish financiers. Of course, he buries his Jewish identity. Seems like there's a trend here. He marries a Christian woman, agrees to have his children baptized. He's appointed as U.S. minister to the Hague, right? And that's a big post, even in the 19th century. So Pierce also helps launch the career of a fellow that, unless you're really into maps, you probably wouldn't know. Share this if I can do. Okay. Wait. Here it is. Screen share. Show all windows. Yes. So here it is. Okay. Hopefully this will work. Can everybody see this? Should look like anything you can familiar? Map of Florida, does it look like that? Hopefully everybody can see it.
Yes, it does. Looks just like Florida.
Only because it is. One of the greatest cartographers of the 19th century was a Jewish fellow from Europe who emigrated here, Julius Bien, who made great maps. The quality of Bien's work comes to Pierce's attention, and he connects him to the Secretary of War. So who is it? This is the Secretary of War in Pierce's administration. Well, a guy named Jefferson Davis. So Julius Bien is commissioned to make maps for the Transcontinental Railway. He does all the map surveys. And his maps of especially the Western territories would become really the gold standard for more than 25 years. This is just his map of Florida. It's really, if you look at it closely, it's really pretty amazing. You can't really see it from this picture so much, but here's the Sunshine State. Pierce didn't get nominated for a second term, and he was bitter about that. When he left office, he remarked, "There's nothing left but to get drunk." And in fact, Pierce became very unpopular because he opposed the use of force to bring the South back into the Union. He denounced the Emancipation Proclamation. Remember, this guy is from New Hampshire. He goes back and lives in Concord, New Hampshire, and up north. Yeah, his attitudes are not particularly loved. In fact, he was so unpopular that it took the natives of his own state 50 years after his death in 1869 before you saw a statue dedicated in his honor. And he was the president of the United States. I mean, most places are eager to claim, that, but it took New Hampshire 50 years to put a statue up. And that leads us now to our penultimate president before Lincoln, is Buchanan. He's the only president to be a bachelor, never married, or during or after. He was also the last American to be born in the 18th century. He had a pretty distinguished career. He was a congressman, he was a senator, he was a U.S. minister to both Russia and Great Britain, Secretary of State. When he was in office, there was a really sad case. There was a book written, I don't remember who wrote it, a couple of years ago, but it's fascinating, about Edgar Mortara, the Mortara case. So who was Mortara? Mortara was a 6-year-old boy
Yeah, he was
living in Bologna, in Italy. Now, in the 1850s, you still had the papal states. They shrank, and then they shrank, and they shrank, and they shrank. But until 18, I want to say 70, there was, the Pope was a secular ruler, not just a religious ruler. He actually, the Catholic Church ruled the papal states. And this woman, a maid who had worked for a Jewish family, was very fond of this little boy, and apparently got sick and almost died. And she was very fearful that he would die without being baptized and go to hell. So she had him baptized. Now, he had no idea what was going on. Sprinkle water, what is that? But it didn't matter. His parents didn't know. She did it secretly. Thing is, well, baptism without consent is absolutely, and was even frowned upon in the Middle Ages. But once it happened, didn't matter. You were still baptized. So this maid's testimony was such that it meant if the boy was baptized, then in fact he was Catholic. You couldn't have Jews raising a Catholic child. So the child was abducted, was removed from his parents' home, and put under the custody of the Catholic Church. Parents, by the way, fought against this, and they lost. The boy ends up being a priest, and he is forever lost to his family. So Jewish leaders really appealed to Buchanan to protest this, and he refused. Not because he was unsympathetic. He felt, though, that it would be inappropriate to be involved in the internal affairs of the country. And also he was concerned, there had been a growing Catholic presence, Irish Catholic, but did you really want to mess with the papal, states? Now Van Buren, if you remember, nearly 20 years before that, had taken a stand when there had been a blood libel in Damascus. In this case, Buchanan, did nothing. But he did offer Judah P. Benjamin the post of minister to Spain, and even Visions of Sunny Spain couldn't, Judah P. Benjamin stayed in the Senate. But he was he was a key advisor to Buchanan. Buchanan was not really, his main, his main thing was, all he wanted to do was to just hold the Union together long enough to get out of office, which he did. I mean, that was his goal in life. He succeeded. So now we're ready for Big Abe. You know that Jews love a particular figure when they try to claim him as Jewish. That's a sure sign, right? Elvis Presley, there's one. So there are all kinds of, proofs that Abraham Lincoln was Jewish, right? Aside from I'll share them with you. I think they're all silly. Abraham Lincoln wasn't Jewish, but I think it's interesting to see how these, the lengths that people go to. In his eulogy for Lincoln, one of the, shakers and movers and shakers of the reform movement in the United States, Isaac M. Weiss, who also, helped found Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati and the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. I mean, he didn't like Lincoln much. He had his sympathies with slavery. He was in Cincinnati. Cincinnati was kind of a mixed city right across the river, the Ohio, from Kentucky. But his eulogy, after Lincoln is killed, suddenly, he discovers he loves Lincoln. And he writes in his eulogy, Lincoln believed himself to be bone from our bone and flesh from our flesh. He supposed himself to be a descendant of Hebrew parentage. He said so in my presence. Now, there's no proof of this. No one's been able, to confirm the conversation. I don't know where Isaac Mayer Weiss gets this, but okay. He had close relationships and friendships with with several Jews, more than any other president up to that point. Is that, that makes you a member of the tribe? I don't think so. He was sympathetic to Jewish causes. Well, so was George Washington. Lincoln never professed to belong to a specific church or denomination, but he liked to refer to the Ten Commandments. That's another quote unquote piece of proof. His name was Abraham. His great grandfather was named Mordecai. But it was also very common in 18th to 19th century America to use biblical names like Uriah. I mean, okay, granted, Uriah was Jewish, but his ancestors came from the town of Lincoln in eastern England. And Lincoln did have an interesting Jewish history. During the Crusades, the sheriff of Lincoln and the Bishop of London had saved the Jews by giving them some protection. So some have theorized that when the Jews were ordered out of England a century later, Abraham Lincoln's ancestors may have been, conversos, secret Jews. Again, he has been described as having Sephardic features. I'm sorry, okay, so it was a good try. We tried. He's not Jewish, but it's okay. Jews throughout the Union came to love him, though. And that love still resonates today. There is even a Lincoln Street in Jerusalem. And if you're interested, there's a whole book written entitled Lincoln and the Jews by historian Jonathan Sarna and Benjamin Chappell. It's a pretty big book with, it's an interesting book. Lincoln probably didn't know any Jews when he was born in Kentucky or grew up in Indiana. But later on in life, he does have a close relationship with any number of Jews. There's Abraham Jonas. Jonas is one of 22 children. He was born in England. He came to the U.S. He settles in Cincinnati. He's one of Lincoln's early friends. Why? He's admitted to the bar and lives in Quincy. So he's a lawyer in Illinois in, the 1830s, 1840s. There are a lot of circuit courts. Lincoln would, ride on his nag from one court to the next, looking for business. And lawyers would often share, hotel rooms. And so he met Abraham Jonas, and he described him as one of his most valued friends. Lincoln appoints him as the postmaster in Quincy, Illinois. And Jonas never traded on his friendship with Lincoln. In fact, and you can argue, really, but his son, his son had become a Confederate soldier. Just shows you how families could be torn apart. So he is a staunch Unionist. He's a friend of Abraham Lincoln. Son is a Confederate soldier. Lincoln's own family actually had both, and Mary Todd Lincoln had brothers who were fighting the Confederacy. But when Jonas's son is captured, he becomes a Union prisoner of war. He refuses to ask Lincoln to intercede for any favors. Only when he's dying in 1864, Jonas's wife writes to Lincoln and asks for permission for their son to be permitted to come to see his dad before he dies. And of course, Lincoln grants it. And Jonas's son arrives literally, within an hour of his father's death. Another one of Lincoln's friends is a fellow named Abraham Cohn, K-O-H-N. Let me see if I can share this up. Here it is. This is a gift that Abraham Cohn, I don't know if anybody, let me make it bigger. This is just actually a replica. He sends him an American flag and inscribes on the white stripes quotes from the book of Joshua in Hebrew. I will not fail or forsake you, be strong and of good courage. Cohn is a well-to-do merchant, also from Illinois, German immigrant, and he goes to Chicago. He becomes a staunch Republican and an ardent abolitionist. Apparently, Cohn and Lincoln liked to discuss the Hebrew Bible. So they would get together and talk politics, but they often spoke more about the Bible than about politics. Lincoln then had a Jewish doctor, Yissachar Zachary. He's a British-born podiatrist. Lincoln had foot problems. I don't know what they were, but he obviously, this guy had some success. And so much so, Lincoln, thought he was such a good podiatrist. Like, if you have a podiatrist you like, and you were president, what kind of mission would you give him? It's like, examine the boots, military, but no, nothing like that. He sends Zachary in 1863 to visit New Orleans to apprise him of the military situation and the take the temperature of the local populace. The folks in New Orleans had a hard time with the military commandant, a fellow named it was General Butler, who they did not like, and he did not like them. They would ladies in New Orleans would empty their chamber pots on the heads of Union soldiers, and Butler then decreed that any woman who did that would be treated as a lady, as a madam of the evening. So they couldn't pour their chamber pots on Union soldiers anymore. So instead, somebody who was enterprising put Butler's picture at the bottom of chamber pots. So they began to print his picture on the porcelain, so you could still show your opinion of Butler. So they got rid of him, and General Nathaniel Banks became the next military commandant, who did a lot better. But Lincoln had sent his podiatrist Zachary as his personal emissary to New Orleans. There is also Simon Wolf, another immigrant from Germany, who serves as a delegate. He's a Democrat, but he converts, so to speak. He becomes a Republican because he is so impressed with Lincoln. And one of my favorite stories is in 1861, Wolf, who is living in Ohio, receives a message that a Jewish soldier is about to be shot for desertion. And the reason why he didn't desert, his mother was dying and he had left camp without permission to visit his dying mother. But he had come back, but he had been court-martialed, convicted of desertion. He was about to be executed. He goes with a local Republican congressman, Thomas Corwin, and they go to Lincoln. And Lincoln at first says, I can't do anything. Edward Stanton, who's the Secretary of War, he has threatened to resign if I interfere in this in any way, if I pardon the boy, and I can't, it's 1861, things are just, I can't afford to lose Stanton. And, Wolfe then kind of confronts the president. And Lincoln, who, was a compassionate man, he was convinced. He ordered the execution halted. And obviously he found a way to convince Stanton not to resign. Parenthetically, the soldier, who returned to his regiment at the Battle of Cold Harbor in 1864, he is killed while leading a charge, holding the American flag aloft. Lincoln hears of this, remembers the story, and he says, I thank God for having done the right thing in staying the execution. And finally, Adolphus Simeon Solomon, the prominent Washington businessman, also a Republican. He helps plan Lincoln's inauguration. In fact, this guy Solomon planned or participated in planning almost every inauguration from Lincoln all the way to Taft in 1908. He lives a long life. He owns he's a publisher. So he publishes books, but he also has a photographic studio. And the last photo of Lincoln is taken in Solomon's photographic studio 5 days before his assassination, April 9th. There are lots of Jews who are, especially German Jews who had, very strong feelings against slavery. It's true there were also German Jews who had emigrated southward, who became, pro-slavery or at least pro-Confederacy. But up in the north, there were lots of Republican Jews. Joseph Seligman, who we'll hear a little bit more when we get to Grant, who is a financier who urges war bonds, buys war bonds, works to sell them to others. Louis N. Dembitz. Sounds vaguely familiar. It's because his nephew, whose middle name is David, changes it to Dembitz in honor of his uncle, and that's Louis Dembitz Brandeis of Kentucky, who is one of 3 delegates at the convention, Republican convention, that puts Lincoln's name into play for the nomination. For Lincoln, there are 2 really important things that he does for the Jewish community, the American Jewish community. Number one is if Jewish chaplains exist today, it's because of Abraham Lincoln. I mean, it's true. If it hadn't been Lincoln, it could well have been someone else along the way, but it was Lincoln. Because at the start of the Civil War, the army was very small. There were only 30 chaplains, all of them Christian. In 1861, in July, as the army is being expanded, Congress passes an act that provides 1 clergy per regiment who would be commissioned in the ranks as a captain, receive the pay of a captain. They had to be Christian. The Jews could serve as chaplains, they just wouldn't have the pay or the rank. So there is a Jewish colonel, Colonel Max Friedman, who is he's the commanding officer of a regiment, Pennsylvania 65th. He decides to test the law, and he persuades Rabbi Arnold Fischel to apply for a position in his regiment, and the application is turned down because he's not Christian. This goes to a whole big to-do. The Board of Delegates of American Israelites, kind of like the ADL of the 19th century, urges Rabbi Fischel to go meet with Lincoln. And it takes about a year, but in July of 1862, the law is redrafted by Congress to allow chaplains, so long as they have been ordained in, in any religious denomination. So Reverend Jacob Frankel, not Fischel, interestingly enough, not Fischel, but Reverend Jacob Frankel, who is a cantor in Philadelphia, becomes the first Jewish chaplain. And there are a total of 3 Jewish chaplains in the Civil War. And then the second thing of importance is, and we'll talk more about this when we get to General Grant, but Grant issues a really disgraceful general order, known as General Order Number 11. Part of the Union's strategy was to strangle the Confederacy's economy, right? You don't want the Confederacy exporting cotton. But there was a black market trade in places, where you could cross rivers like the Ohio River, and you could smuggle cotton. So Grant gets it into his head, without really very much proof, that Jews are primarily responsible. As we'll see, and again, I'll talk more about this with Grant. His father Jesse, was a schemer. Grant's father was always scheming. He always had an angle. Grant didn't always have a great relationship with his dad, and he was in league with two Jewish businessmen who were going to give Jesse Grant a cut if they could get him to persuade Ulysses to allow for cotton to be confiscated and then used to make Union uniforms. Could have been very lucrative. Grant refuses to use his position. Grant is, whatever else he is very honest and personal, even though he ends up having one of the most corrupt administrations, but he himself is not personally involved. But anyway, he gets into his mind that this is a Jewish thing. So he orders all Jews in his military Department of the Tennessee, parts of Tennessee, Mississippi, and Kentucky, to leave within 24 hours. Expels them. And not all these expulsions happened. And one of the great ironies, the Jews of Holly Springs, Mississippi are all set to be expelled when a Confederate force under Earl Van Dorn comes in and saves the Jews from expulsion. And there's a Confederate force that saves Jews from expulsion that Grant was going to, you can't make these things up. One place, though, where Jews were expelled was Paducah, Kentucky. And so all 30 Jewish families are kicked out. And one of the fellows, a guy named Cesar J. Haskell, who's a merchant, sends a telegram to Lincoln and then goes with a delegation to Washington. He arrives on January 3rd, 1863. Now, you think Lincoln would be busy, right? He just issued the Emancipation Proclamation 2 days earlier. But he finds time to meet with Haskell. And the next day, he orders Grant, he rescinds General Order Number 11. So Lincoln is eulogized by many Jews after his assassination. There's a synagogue in Boston, Congregation Ohavei Shalom, drapes the synagogue with black hangings for 30 days. And they decreed that they would recite the El Malei Rachamim, the memorial prayer, on Torah reading days, Mondays, Thursdays, and Shabbat afternoons during the mourning period of 30 days for Lincoln. Not the only place. There were lots of eulogies in Jewish newspapers. Sabato Moraes is a Philadelphia rabbi, one of the founders, a little over 20 years later of JTS, compared Lincoln to the great Hillel. But maybe the most moving tribute to Lincoln was that written by Solomon Schechter. Schechter was only a teenager when Lincoln was killed, and he was in Europe. But when he came to the United States and became the president of the Jewish Theological Seminary in 1901, he wrote an essay about Abraham Lincoln. He published it in a book called Seminary Addresses and Other Papers. And he wrote, "We may be grateful to God for having given us such a great soul as Lincoln, who, under God, gave this nation a new birth of freedom, and to our dear country, which by its institutions and its people rendered possible the greatness for which Abraham Lincoln shall stand forever." So the last thing I want to do, and comments and questions, but I thought this would be perhaps a good way to end. This is a tribute to Abraham Lincoln by a Jewish musician. Some of you may recognize the piece. I'm not playing it in its entirety. I'm just going to play a short excerpt, about 3 minutes worth. You can, some of you may identify it right off the bat. If not, I will tell you afterwards what it is. This is just the last 3 minutes of it.
Lincoln was a quiet man. Abe Lincoln was a quiet and a melancholy man. But when he spoke of democracy, this is what he said. He said, "As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master." This expresses my idea of democracy. Whatever differs from this, to the extent of a difference, is no democracy. Abraham Lincoln, 16th President of these United States, is everlasting in the memory of his countrymen. For on the battleground at Gettysburg, this is what he said. He said that from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, and that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom and the government of the people, by the people, and for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Anybody recognize? You can.
Lincoln Portrait by Aaron Copland.
Yes.
I got that.
Yeah. So yeah, and the no, that wasn't Darth Vader, but it was James Earl Jones. Over the years, they've had some incredible narrators who have done the narration for that. But Aaron Copland, of course, nice Jewish boy. Copland writes that in just a few months into the U.S.'s involvement in World War II. And I think writes it very much against the background of things happening in Europe. Being inspired by and thinking of Abraham Lincoln. So I don't think it's coincidental that Copland, a composer who was Jewish, wrote the Lincoln Portrait. But Jews, for whatever reason, have had maybe it was his humility, his whatever it was. I think Jews gravitate toward Abraham Lincoln in a way that he seems more human than some of the other presidents. Now it's also true that there were prior to him, he had a whole bunch of pretty mediocre presidents too. We're very fortunate that Lincoln was the president to to use a term that George Washington favored, providential. Lincoln was president. Anyway, let me stop here. So questions, comments, observations. John, did you?
Just a note on Franklin Pierce. One of the sad stories on Pierce was, in fact, an alcoholic, as you said, but one of the things that made his alcoholism worse is he and his wife were on their way to Washington to be inaugurated. Their son was killed in a train wreck, which absolutely destroyed Mrs. Pierce, I understand. She was not much of the White House hostess. But oddly enough, a Pierce descendant ended up in the White House indirectly. Barbara Bush.
Oh, yes.
Her name is Pierce.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought about that.
The other nice thing about Benjamin, of course, and I've read that biography that Eli Evans wrote, of course, is that they forget that he may have turned down a judgeship in the United States, but of course, he ends up as a Queen's Counsel after he escapes and gets back to England. And I think his book on contracts is in its 4th printing. They're still using it.
That's interesting.
Benjamin on contracts.
He might have made an interesting Supreme Court justice.
Indeed.
Although, honestly, there were some horrible decisions like the Dred Scott case, and I have, which essentially said that Black people could not sue in a court of law because if they were property and they couldn't be citizens. So I don't know if Benjamin would have dissented in that case.
Yeah, Taney's dissent was that they had no rights that a white man needed to respect. He put that in writing.
Yeah, he was not a bargain either.
Okay.
Any other? Let's see if just go ahead, Georgia. You want to?
Yes, yeah, I was interested in the immigration policy. If there was so much anti-Semitism, how did this wave of people came in, like in the 1840s and later? There
really wasn't. I mean, there was anti-Semitism if you were a David Levy Yulee, if you had a position of power, right, and you were in the U.S. Senate. But the fact that he could even rise to that level, Jews were not. Look, there were people who did not like immigrants in general. It wasn't necessarily Jews. In fact, there's a whole party, the nativists, the Know Nothings, right? So can you imagine a whole political party? We talked today about how a particular, let me be careful not to get political, but a particular wing of a particular party today, can be so anti-immigrant. Can you imagine an entire political party whose main basis was, to not only stop immigration, but to demonize those that had already immigrated. In the 1830s and 1840s, the real animus was against the Irish. Terrible prejudice against the Irish, not really the Jews. But again, that didn't mean that there was no anti-Semitism, especially against visible figures. Levy's a visible figure. Judah Benjamin is a visible figure. But the fact that even so, they're offered plum positions says something about the quality of our leadership, and nowhere else in Europe would that have been the case. Anywhere.
During the Civil War, Lincoln encouraged the Jews to go into Alexandria and into Arlington, where they set up businesses because there were that ensured that there were more Yankees than Southerners along the border of Washington.
Well, Lincoln was certainly, Lincoln had his own prejudices to overcome, especially when it came to Black people. He came a long way. We'll never know how much further he might have come. But I think it's also important to know that Lincoln was not, a fire-eating abolitionist. He didn't like slavery. He despised it, but he was prepared to accept it where it existed. The Republican Party was committed only to ensure that it did not spread anywhere else. But he accepted that it was constitutional and legal. And for the first year of the war, despite abolitionists pushing him, he kept hoping the South might come back, and he refused to entertain the idea of abolition. You read Frederick Douglass's letters, and Douglass, who came to respect Lincoln, despised him tremendously in 1862 until the Emancipation Proclamation. Even then, right, because Lincoln was abolishing slavery in places where the Union really had no control. Not in places, there were 4 Union states where slavery was legal until the 13th Amendment was ratified. So we forget that sometimes, that Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri all were part of the Union, some more tenuously than others, but slavery was legal in all of them. Any other, go ahead, Dr. Cantor?
Yeah, I have two comments. One is a question. There's a Levy County in Florida. Was that named after one of the Levys, and which one?
David Levy Yulee. He was a big Florida booster, and Levy County is where Cedar Key is. And the reason that matters is Cedar Key was the terminus of Florida's first railroad. So you had a railroad that was cross Florida and that connected the booming port of Fernandina. And it was a booming port in those days in its own way. And then it connected by rail to Cedar Key, which was on the Gulf. And so you could ship goods that came from the Atlantic to the Gulf Coast and not have to go all the way around Florida. And so Yulee built that railroad, and Levy County is named after him. They didn't call it Yulee County.
Yeah, the second comment is a number of years ago, I was part of an American delegation to an international conference that took place in Geneva, Switzerland. And one evening I went over to the American consulate, and in the American consulate, there were guards who are Marines, not Jewish. And I said, you know, Geneva is very nice, the people are very friendly. And the Marine said, well, don't kid yourself, because during the Second World War, when Jewish people wanted to cross the border from Germany into Switzerland, they weren't allowed in. So,
Oh no, the Swiss were not, and some of it was fear, and some of it was anti-Semitism. I mean, they were also very good at taking Jewish money and not, and not returning it even after the war. So it took 50, 60 plus years to squeeze some of the money that, I mean, the Swiss, there were life insurance policies, there were bank accounts, and they claimed that they had just disappeared. Yeah, they were mamzerim, to use a technical term. They were not very nice to, there was a Jewish community. If you were a Jewish citizen who was Swiss, you could, live okay. But no, they didn't want refugee Jews. And they were more than happy to take Nazi gold in their own pockets.
But they make good watches.
Well, okay.
And they have good chocolate.
They're fine. No.
Well, see, you have to say something good about them.
No, I mean, look, I mean, I like Swiss cheese. I mean, everybody's,
There's a piece of information about Cedar Key. They had cedar trees, and that's where they made pencils.
Yeah.
And that was the big thing, that they get the cedar and they sent it off to Fernandina, and the pencils were made elsewhere.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah. So, and so Yulee was very, and the family was they really, you don't get a county named after you in Florida unless you've, done something for the state. But it's just kind of
Yulee,
funny,
Florida?
Because there is, it's, Levy County is probably the most, not the most, but it's a pretty grayish county. There's no, there is no, there's just no. Are there Jews in Levy County? There probably is 2, 3. Who knows?
How about Yulee, Florida? I mean, that's a small town outside of Fernandina.
Right. So Yulee is not, but anyway, so he's, not somebody that one can particularly admire, given his racism, his advocacy for flogging in the U.S. Navy. But you have to grant the fact that he did help develop Florida and was a big Florida booster and big proponent of statehood. So,
yeah, the third comment I want,
and a friend of Polk and particularly Millard Fillmore.
I think too, every week. Whatever his name is.
Anybody else? Other questions, comments?
comment. And you mentioned the Civil War, and I've heard this from several different people, that given what's going on in the United States, the problems, the racism, etc., whether we're going to have a smooth transition or not between administrations, that this could lead to another civil war. Do you agree with anything like that?
No. In the very last session, which will be 2 days before the inauguration, I will talk about 2024 and onward, what Jews should look for in a president in a nonpartisan way. Because I think, I've thought about this a lot. I don't see a civil war happening. But you don't need a civil war to see the kind of real division. It's not, geographical per se, although it is in the sense of, cities versus rural areas, versus suburban areas. And having just recently taken a drive through some very rural parts of our country, upstate New York, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Virginia, very rural areas. So, the some of what joined those areas together has nothing, I saw more Confederate, let me put it this way. I was in Mississippi this summer. I saw more Confederate flags in upstate New York than in Mississippi.
And it's not even the haves and the have-nots.
Well, and I don't want to, go to, but that's not, I'm not saying I saw like, in every barn there was no. I saw 3 or 4 Confederate flags, which for me in upstate New York is a lot. For me, that's a lot. I just felt bad because they obviously haven't had Wi-Fi because they don't know that the war was lost. So to get their Wi-Fi fixed and find out that, anyway, but it was, there is a lot of division in this country, and anybody who thought that the election would end it, I think was, naive. Wishful, but we have a long way to go. But I don't see a civil war.
We're looking forward to your program where people can talk political without making enemies or something like that. Isn't that coming up?
Civil discourse. That's just about how to. It's like how to be nice while you're talking politics, but it's not the same as talking politics. It's how do you have civil discourse, which people can do.
Well, there's been a lot of families and friendships broken up over the political heat of the day.
I think it's really important that we realize how much worse it was in the Civil War. We have really not seen anything. Where families were torn apart, and it wasn't a question of we better not talk politics at the Thanksgiving table. It was people, killing each other from the same family.
That was also geographic, Rabbi. Now it's more localized in a way.
Well, yes and no. There were, believe it or not, there were people from the South who remained loyal to the Union.
They didn't advertise it for sure.
Well, some of them were great commanding generals, and vice versa. Fellow who surrendered, General Pemberton, who surrendered Vicksburg, was a Pennsylvanian. His wife was from the South, and so he went with the Confederacy. General George Thomas, was a great general in the Union Army, was from Virginia. So you had people who, so it's more than you would think. But anyway, yes, the geography was much more close, was much more cut and dried than, in some ways now. But anyway, we digress. Any other questions, comments, or we'll call it a night? Thank you for everybody joining us so next time we're going to focus on the post-Civil War. Grant, fascinating figure. And we'll try to unpack General Order Number 11 a little bit more. Mm-hmm. And we'll get up hopefully to the end of the century with McKinley. President McKinley. So I wish everybody a Lila Tov, a good night.
Thank you, Rabbi.
See you soon.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Hello, Tom.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Sure, be well.
Thank you, Rabbi. Good night.
Good night, good night.
Night.